Now, the origins of free speech go all the way back to the start of democracy. And the idea of free speech and the value of freedom of expression in relation to underpinning a healthy, functional democracy has always been there. However, there was no formal recognition of free speech in law until 1776, and that was in British law. So that idea that free speech is kind of a given, but where it appears in law has always been, to a certain extent in some countries ambiguous, and how it's applied is ambiguous, has been there from the start. And to go back to that idea about freedom of speech not simply being about liberty, it's really about preventing government censorship. The origins of free speech, at least, are really about preventing government censorship and suppressing ideas that would reduce the power of governments, the aristocracy, the monarchy, and the church. And of course, when you think about it that way, it's very easy to understand that freedom of speech as a concept was not always a popular idea. So the invention of the printing press in particular led to the ruling classes beginning to fear that the lower classes would challenge their authority. And of course, that happened. And many people would say that if not everyone, would say that that's a good thing. So the link between freedom of speech, the growth of mass media, and democracy was further cemented through events like the French Revolution and the American Revolution. And of course, the First Amendment in the US Bill of Rights is seen as kind of the classic statement of free speech. We all know, even if we're not American, we all know what the First Amendment is. Even if we can't quote it, we know what it refers to. Now, the really interesting thing there is that the people who drew up the US Constitution and the Bill of Rights declared free speech a natural or unalienable right. So we're born with it as humans, rather than being given that freedom by the government. So in that very important definition or that very, very important statement, if you like, of free speech, is the idea that freedom of speech and freedom of expression is somehow a natural and unchangeable part of all of us. And we're going to see that underlying kind of ideology, that underlying approach, does in many respects muddy debates about freedom of expression when it comes to questions such as causing harm or the quality of expression and the impact that might have on our public conversations. So that's a point we're going to return to. The idea that freedom of speech is a natural part of who we are versus forms of social power and how freedom of expression gets played out in that social power, in displays of that social power. Now, the end of the Second World War and the post-World War II period and the kind of global political, social, and legal changes that were made in the wake of the Second World War meant that free speech became seen as a universal human right, and it did achieve kind of legal status as a fundamental human right through the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights. And again, an article that we are all familiar with, even if we don't know what it exactly says, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, section 19, are kind of, along with the First Amendment in the US Bill of Rights, seen as the gold standards relating to free speech and freedom of expression. Now, even though we do accept freedom of speech and freedom of expression as kind of inalienable rights that apply in all nations, and they are, protected by the UN, all nations have to balance freedom of expression against other competing values, such as national security and economic growth. And that's that idea of economic growth is a particularly important one for developing nations who need, who need to grow their economies in order to be able to sustain themselves, sustain their populations, and compete on a global stage. So as a result, different countries interpret freedom of speech in different ways. So, for example, in North Korea, protection of the community is more important than individual rights. So an individual's right to freedom of expression is secondary to the development of North Korean society. In Thailand, there is limited legal and social protections for freedom of speech. So it's actually illegal to criticize the monarchy in Thailand. Russia, particularly in the wake of the fall of communism and the increasing, at least on the surface, democratization of and liberalization of Russian society, and in Indonesia, again, on the surface, there are strong free speech laws, but these are either weakly enforced or easily overridden by other laws. Now, it's important to stress that while we could criticize Russia and Indonesia for that approach, having laws which are not enforced, the same thing could be said about Australia. And we're going to see that in later parts of this module. And in Germany, the value of human dignity and equality is placed before freedom of speech. So in Germany, and for obvious reasons, the preservation of democracy is the primary concern. So we can see the range of ways that different governments, different nations interpret free speech can either enhance notions of freedom of expression, but also we could see how they constrain freedom of expression as well. And as we're going to see, and I think this is an important point that I want to keep stressing, Australia is not exempt from these criticisms. So we will explore some of those in more detail later in the module.